it's not the end of the world, but it's the end of an era, basically. I think that's possible. It would take a different form. And so the 1930s were a pretty disinflationary decade. And that's because you had the popping of a private debt bubble. And so you had basically underutilization of existing capacity. So you had commodity oversupply, you had low economic output, and the economy had a tough time kind of bouncing back and responding to that. Whereas I think that to the extent that we've run into a calamity this decade, and I think we're seeing kind of early signs of one due to energy crisis, I think it'd be more of an inflationary type of depression, right? I think that basically, if I look at the bottlenecks of what could make this decade really, really bad, it's, partially what's happening with the money system, but it's more so what's happening with the real movement of essential goods, right? So it's really about, can people get the energy they need? And energy is kind of the master resource that affects everything else. And so if you look back in history, even though individual countries can kind of reduce their energy use, the world almost never reduces its energy use because, there's so much developing, countries around the world. There's still people that need a lot more energy. And even the countries in developed markets that have been able to kind of flatten their energy use, it's in large part because they shipped some of the most energy intensive production to those developing countries. So they kind of got it off their balance sheet and out of mind, even though they're still actually benefiting from that higher energy consumption. And the only times where global energy usage went down year over year, one was, a kind of a 3-year period in the early 1980s, which is basically when Volcker basically put the kind of the U.S. into a severe recession. You had a Latin American debt crisis, you had a big dollar spike, and you had this kind of just really rough global macro environment for a few years. So that was number one. That was actually the last time that consumer sentiment was anywhere near this low, was that period, right? So that was a terrible period for almost everyone. The other one was the global financial crisis. You had 1 year of, less energy uses than the year prior. And then the third instance was 2020, the whole COVID crash, and basically, economic lockdowns and shut-ins and reduced air travel and things like that. And so generally reductions in energy consumption are associated with the worst economic environments in modern history, right? The whole kind of post-World War II era. I don't have data for energy consumption during the 30s, but it would not have been pretty, possibly worse. And so I think that that's one of the key things to look at is if we do have serious trouble getting the energy we need, that's where you can get really bad, humanitarian outcomes. And it doesn't affect everyone equally. It depends on where you are physically, what resources you have available to you. So that's the thing. Like if there's an economic thing that keeps me up at night, it's about energy security, energy distribution, and then all these kind of other things come later. So the money system, all that is really bad. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, can we get energy? Can we heat our homes in the winter? Can we, get food on the table, right? Because even, a lot of fertilizers are made from natural gas, right? And so if natural gas, like in Europe, it just looks like a Weimar chart, that making fertilizer in Europe is going to look like a Weimar chart, right? So basically, it really comes down to whether or not we have abundant energy. It's the end of something big, right? But of course, the end is a long process, and it can be a decade-long process. So I think that basically, with the long-term debt cycle, every several decades, when you reach a massive amount of debt, when you go down to zero interest rates, and you have kind of just massive amounts of debt in the system, usually you go through some sort of currency devaluation and system change, right? So it's not the end of the world, but it's the end of an era, basically. And I think that's something we're seeing in a number of markets. But, to get less doomy than that, if we focus more on the near term, we're in a, cyclical downturn. And not all cyclical downturns become recessions, but some subset of them do. And so when we look back over the past, let's say pre-COVID, we had like a 10-year long, economic expansion in the United States. We still had 3 cycles within that decade-long period of accelerating growth and then decelerating growth. And it just that the decelerating growth never became negative growth. It never became an outright recession, even though you had a couple near misses there. And so what we've been in over the past more than a year now is a decelerating growth environment. And then combined with the fact that this one is so inflationary, kind of leading up to that, that this one is becoming more severe and is kind of starting to look like a recession, at least by many indicators. So it does not look like a recession in terms of employment yet, but by most other, especially leading indicators, it does look more recessionary. And tying this into crypto, to the extent that I'm here, historically, when you look at the Bitcoin and crypto bull markets, a lot of people tie it to the Bitcoin halving, which I think is relevant to some extent, but it also actually matches up very, very closely with these economic accelerating and decelerating environments. And so, for example, we can use the Purchasing Managers Index. It's kind of a go-to macro indicator for economic acceleration or decelerating. It looks like a sine wave over time, and they average roughly 3-year cycles. And it just so happens that all the Bitcoin bull runs were during these rising PMI environments, and all of the downward or choppy sideways periods were in declining PMI environments. And of course, that all of crypto kind of goes up and down together, maybe with a little bit of a lag. And a lot of what dictates the PMI environments is also liquidity conditions. And so central banks and kind of dollar liquidity around the world, generally, one of the big questions was, for example, why is Bitcoin not serving as an inflation hedge? And of course, that would extend to any sort of finite token. Why are these things going down when you ironically have high inflation of fiat currencies? And there's actually really good charts out there that show, Bitcoin in particular. I use that one because that's what most of the macro people will look at, because that's the biggest, most liquid one. And you'll see that, in rising global M2, so rising global money supply year over year, Bitcoin does very well in that environment. And now we're actually in a period where money supply is growing more slowly than it was a year or two ago. And you have multiple central banks, mainly the Fed, kind of pushing back and strengthening the dollar compared to many other currencies. And so when you translate all that back into USD denominated global M2 growth, it actually kind of came to a standstill. So ironically, now that price inflation is happening with a lag from monetary inflation, and some central banks are actually fighting back, it makes more sense as why we're seeing kind of downward price action in a number of assets, including Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies.
Join Margex and get a $50 bonus by signing up through the link in the description. Moreover, by depositing 0.004 or more BTC, you will get an additional $50. The minimum deposit is only $10 and the minimum trade size is $1. You will never find any hidden commissions on Margex, and all deal indicators are on screen and available in real time.